AARP volunteers. AARP is the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering people like myself, 50 and older, to choose how we live as we age. AARP Houston is dedicated to providing resources and information to those caring for their loved ones. And with over 3.4 million caregivers in Texas, AARP Houston is proud to sponsor Mindful Mondays, a caregiver series in partnership with Caregiver Wellness Retreat. AARP has prepared a care guide resources designed to help to develop and implement a caregiving plan for a loved one or a friend. The guide includes ways to assess your loved one's needs, tips for organizing essential documents, a roundup of federal and national resources, information on caring for yourself, checklists, medication chart, and contact lists. Visit aarp.org/caregiving to download your guide. You can also visit aarp.org/Houston for more virtual events and resources in your community. And I will put that information in the chat for you. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm just going to add my pin there. So I'll just give you a little bit of an overview and then a little menu for our time together today. This is being recorded. So if you've signed up for, I think you had to click if you wanted to sign up for the other 5 sessions together. And what I did notice that's a little funky about Zoom is that last session on April 18th was hidden. You had to actually scroll up a little bit. So I put in the chat box the Zoom registration link, and I'll put that in the chat again. So if you only registered for this time, or if you know you only registered for 5 rather than 6, you can go back and click on the sessions that you'd like to be registered for, and that will enable you to get reminders for our session. And just another housekeeping note, by registering for this, you did agree to be recorded today. And so we are recording. If for any reason that you don't want to be on the recording, keep in mind, I'm actually just pinning myself. So even if you unmute yourself, I hope technology goes my way. You shouldn't be on the recording itself, but your voice might be. If you prefer to communicate just through chat, that's great. What I really appreciate about this design of doing it versus doing it a webinar version is I really get to see you all. And I think it's quite important for us to connect in this way, especially many of us are still not able to connect in person, especially if we're caregiving for someone else right now. And so if you have any questions or comments throughout, I will do my best to monitor the chat box. We'll see how that goes. But I wanted to just make sure we're all okay with those right off the bat. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. And Lee is also going to put all of those links for AARP. And we're really grateful that for the sponsorship of this time together. So that brings me to why I'm here. Caregiver Wellness Retreat is a nonprofit, and we've been doing this about my dad was like, haven't you been doing it over 10 years? I'm like, no, just 7 years, Dad. It feels like longer. And the organization was actually started in honor of my dad, who was a caregiver for my stepmom, who had early onset Alzheimer's. And so her progress from her late 50s and until the time of her passing meant that my dad was a caregiver for over a decade. And his time was really spent in the care of her. And watching him was a really big testimony to me as to what the role of a caregiver is and how both challenging it is, and also what I witnessed in my own father was a transformation, really, a deepening in compassion and a deepening in his own giving to someone else. And then what I realized afterward is that that caregiving toll continued to linger even after she passed. And so what we do with Caregiver Wellness Retreat and our partnership today with AARP is to bring a few resources for you and mindfulness that I hope that you can put in your back pocket, almost like a buffet. You can kind of pick and choose things that really resonate with you. And there may be actually some things that you already do. In fact, if you have a mindfulness practice or a favorite ritual that you do for either for your physical health or for your well-being, I'd love for you to add that into the chat box. You can also, if you're already unmuted, you could say out loud what you do. We're going to go over quite a few practices today, but I'd love to know or hear about some things that you're already doing to care for yourself. Add this in. Jill, do you have a practice that you do?
I journal every morning.
You journal. Oh yeah.
Journal, yeah, every morning. Yeah.
Fantastic. You do more like stream of consciousness, or do you have specific questions that you answer?
Stream of consciousness, what's on my mind, little prayer, whatever.
So I'm curious then, Jill, after you have that experience, do you notice what you sense in your body or even any differences in emotion? What is that for you?
Usually I'm feeling more centered. If I come to it with any anxiety, it's usually lowered.
Yeah.
And this morning, and I've done this before, I just went back and started rereading old journal entries, and it really helped put things in perspective. So it's a very, very important tool for me.
Yeah, that's actually really key. And we're going to talk about this in a future series session. It's a key to resiliency, being able to look back and look at your sort of grit, so to speak, how well you were able to overcome a challenge or a struggle. And that reminder reinforces and actually strengthens your grit. And it's one of those things that really is a tool that we often overlook. We think sometimes looking back is rumination, but in fact, when we look back toward things that we have overcome or that we are overcoming, it just builds us and grows us and strengthens us. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Jill. Thank you. And Robert put in that he's reading, prayer, meditation, guitar lessons, and time alone. We're going to talk a little bit more about time alone and sort of that, how to hit the reset button in just a little bit. And Lee put, she takes time to read her Bible and she walks to clear her head and practices thankfulness. So gratitude practice is another one we'll talk about in a later session. So I'm actually going to share my screen here just for a moment and get a couple of clicks there. Hang on just a second. Technology is so much fun. There's a little bit of sarcasm today. There we go. Perfect. All right. So defining wellness and well-being was a really big one for me. And this one has kind of come over the years as I've gone. And I think wellness is sometimes tied up into a bow or a package along with sort of some platitudes about self-care. And typically wellness is tied to this idea of physical well-being. So really about more the physicality of self. But well-being itself, as opposed to wellness, is less industry-like, less marketing-like. And it really has to do with this idea of us being encompassed in a holistic alignment or congruency with our bodies, even if they are not perfect, which they aren't, or pain-free. And so that was just, I think, such a big light bulb moment for me to really understand the fullness of that. Because I think sometimes we think, well, I'm going to be I'm going to be healthy, or I'm going to start eating better, or I'm going to, or I wish I could have, or I don't know why I can't, or we become stuck in sort of some pattern loops. It's so important to recognize that well-being has to do with how we are in the present moment. And how we are in the present moment, each moment is an opportunity for us to shift or to change or to garner a new perspective. And so a mindfulness practice is really, I think, pretty critical for that. This is one of my favorite definitions by Viktor Frankl. If you're not familiar with his existential work, he was a Holocaust survivor. He writes that the space between stimulus and response is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And our response lies in our growth and our freedom. And so my definition of mindfulness is really that moment in which we become aware of something. We recognize something, either a sensation in our body, or like Jill mentioned, she noticed that she was feeling a little more at calm. So that moment where we recognize or become aware, and then there's a space, there's a pause. And in that pause, we have the ability to either act or react. And so the pause gives us the embodiment to choose presence. It's not easy to pause. I have a teenager, so I can attest to that. Pausing is not my gift. It is something I've had to practice. And I firmly believe that each of these things are founded in the idea of repetition, 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 because many of these qualities and these characteristics of caregivers, which I'm sure many of you can really relate to, right? We have to be patient. We have to have some kind of self-care. We need to be creative and good planners. As caregivers, we have to be forgiving. Willing to ask for help, willing to receive help, or sometimes not, right? We're expected to be tough and have grit and to be positive. We're expected to solve problems and be compassionate. It's really difficult to teach those kinds of things. Some of them are not inherent to us, right? But with practice, with that ability to pause, we can begin to cultivate things that are often things that we feel are traits, but they can become more states. They can be part of our being when we begin to practice these things. So, another definition of mindfulness is being able to have an alert mind and a quiet body state. So fully present to what's happening in the moment. Not necessarily easy to do. It's certainly, again, more about a practice. So the benefits of mindfulness, I'm sure I could give you a lot longer list and a laundry list. And probably more importantly, I would love to hear, and you could type into the chat box, some things that your practices have done for you, much as Jill mentioned, what journaling did for her. For me, being able to practice mindfulness does give me that pause when I want to just snap sometimes. And the only way not to snap is to practice the pause. You have to practice the embodiment of what you would like to happen, right? It helps you create awareness. You can develop compassion, kindness, and one of the key ingredients to mindfulness, non-judgment. So being able to fully face what's in the moment without having the critical dialogue or placing a label on it. One of my favorite sayings from a meditation teacher, Tara Brach, she uses the phrase, just this. Something pops up, just this. And so it gives me the ability to have a little bit more of objectivity. Instead of starting to define, Oh, that's bad. Oh, that's so bad. Or that's really good. That's great. And I think sometimes we have to find that middle path of being able to say, oh, okay, so crankiness has arrived today. Let's see what it has to say to me. Or anxiousness. I feel my heart beating really quickly. Okay. And what do I need to do in response to that? So it also helps, as I just mentioned, decrease stress and improve impulse control and strengthen relationships. And we're going to talk about connection and relationships in a later session. So we're going to go through, I mentioned that I would give you a menu today. We're going to go through a series of a few different practices. So we'll kind of bounce back and forth with chatting together and actually some experiential things. And so our first practice that we'll do is simply the pause. So however you are is absolutely perfect. And in fact, you can just simply take your legs if they're crossed and uncross them. And the reason I like to do this is it gives me a sense of, which is something else, sorry, Jillian, the only one that's spoken up today. It gives a sense of feeling the ground or centeredness. So just notice that when you uncross your legs and you're noticing your feet on the ground, what that does is it takes attention away from our brain, right, and moves it into our body. And it moves it into a more of a somatic experience. Another thing you can notice is simply what your sits bones are connected to or how it feels to be sitting in your seat. For example, can you feel the connection between your buttocks and the seat? Maybe you can also notice where your arms land. And go ahead and take a moment to take the eyes just slightly off the computer. So you can let it land just below, to the side, to the right. Just allow your eyes to land somewhere just away from the electronics, since we're looking at that quite a bit. You could even close your eyes if you feel comfortable. So just taking a moment to really just check in. How am I today? How am I today? And so if a particular word or a sensation or emotion popped into your mind, can you almost imagine it like one of those cartoons, like a word bubble above your head? So if the word was content, you can imagine it just popping up there. Or if the word is stress or anxiousness, or even calm or relaxed. Take a moment to just simply notice what word or what emotion arrived. And so if you could imagine it just slightly outside of yourself, you don't have to embody that. You can actually just observe it. So just observing for a moment. Then I'll encourage you to toggle back and forth with either feeling your seat or your feet and this sensation or emotion that came up. It's almost like a rocking chair. You can kind of imagine, hello, I see you, I observe this emotion. Noticing my body, feel my feet, or feel my seat. And then let your attention go all the way down into your feet. You could imagine the next expiration of your breath almost just drains down into the ground below your feet. So the inhale is easy, normal. And the exhale is like a fountain that drains down below your feet. And one more breath. And one more drain. And when you're ready, you can bring your eyes or attention back. You can take a moment to either note it if you have a little pad and paper or anything that you've got nearby, or you can even type it into the chat box, maybe what the emotion is, but then how you feel now. One of the concepts that we'll continuously talk about with mindfulness is the ability to see or perceive change. So as you begin a practice, checking in, feeling what you feel, not necessarily judging it, just saying hello to it, taking that breath. So the exercise we just did is the pause. So we're feeling our feet, or feeling where we're sitting, feet or seat. And that helps us stay right here in the moment with whatever is kind of churning. And then when you're done, you take that little litmus. How does it feel now? And it's okay to acknowledge that there's no change, but if there is a slight change, then that gives your body that little dose of dopamine, that little bit of recognition of, there is change. There's subtlety to it. And it helps us to repeat the pattern so that the pause can become more of a habit. Lee said she felt some peace afterward. So our next little example that we'll do together is just, can be either seated or standing. So if you've been sitting a lot, then you might want to stand. And vice versa. So some of you have maybe standing desks. And then allow your arms. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to sit so that you can see me well. But if you stood up, and allow your arms to just drape by your side. Even if you're on your chair, you might scoot forward just a little bit. And I will say, I am making a lot of assumptions in our abilities today. And so I want to be very mindful of accessibility in regards to anything that we practice together throughout our sessions. I'm well aware that some of us have difficulty standing or may not be able to stand. I might cue a certain part of the body, and that might not be accessible for you, depending on what your abilities are. And so I fully recognize that. And I know that you'll make adjustments and accommodations as you hear things for how it makes sense for you. A lot of times when I cue perhaps a particular movement, you can just simply imagine it. Our brains are incredibly powerful. It's as if we were playing constantly, right? A movie in our mind. And if you're not quite sure what I mean, maybe you can reflect back to the last movie that made you cry or laugh or get a little scared. Well, that's exactly how our brains work. Our brains have difficulty telling the difference between a screen in front of us and the actuality of life. So we have a visceral response to it, which might be laughter, crying, or feeling a little afraid. So our imagination is just that powerful. So if there is an ability that I ever mention, please continue to use your imagination, because it truly is powerful. So whether you're seated or standing, let your arms kind of drape by your side. So let them kind of hang as long as you can. And you can choose your right or your left hand. And I'm going to just choose my right hand. And begin to make a fist with the hand. And as you make a fist, you might notice that the muscles in your forearms tighten, maybe the muscles in your bicep tighten. And in fact, imagine that you have a piece of paper underneath your armpit and hug that in just a little bit. So now you can feel the whole arm get tense. So feel that tension all the way through the right arm. And then on the next exhale that you have, relax your hand, slowly open it, and notice what happens to that arm. Notice which arm feels longer. Notice which arm feels more alive. Notice which arm feels warmer. So it's probably the arm that you made the fist in. And then allow your attention to toggle. If it's helpful for you to go inside by closing the eyes, you could do that, or you can look down. Let your attention toggle to the left arm. No need to make a fist. Just paying attention to the left arm, from the shoulder to the elbow to the hand. And the moment they start to feel the same sensation or the same length, you can bring your attention back. Yeah, it was pretty quick for Lee. Anyone else, was it fairly quick to start to feel them become the same length? Now, was one arm longer than the other? I mean, some of us might have one arm longer than another, but generally speaking, right? No, right? In our minds, it is so powerful. We have the ability to create sensation. In fact, you can take your right hand and just begin to rub the fingers together. And as you do that, you might notice maybe it's getting a little bit warmer, starting to feel a little different from the left hand. And then go ahead and drop the arms again, opening the hand. Notice how tingly that hand feels, how alive. Maybe there's a feeling of pulsation or blood rushing or movement within the hand and the bones. And then once again, toggle your attention to the other side. And when they start to feel the same, you can open your eyes or bring your eyes back. For some of you, quicker than others, yeah. So if you're standing, you can sit, or if you're seated, you can move around. Remember that you are not obligated to be directly in front of your computer during this time. I think one of the things that is really quite beautiful about a mindfulness practice, which is sort of a cousin to a meditation practice or a contemplative practice, is we often think we have to be incredibly still. I would beg to differ. I think we can respond to our body's needs, and that in and of itself is a form of awareness and being tender with ourselves. When I first was learning meditation, I remember actually had a German meditation teacher, and not to stereotype Germans, but I will say he was incredibly strict. We went to meditation, the door was locked if you were not on time. You had to sit in a certain way. You had to sit for periods of time, and each day, this course went over a month's period daily. Each day we increased the length of time in which we sat. And it was around about day 7 where tears are streaming down my face, because it was painful for me to sit in one position for a period of time. One, my body really wasn't adapted to it. 7 days wasn't long enough, but my body itself didn't like the way that I was sitting. My hips and just didn't feel right for me. And so that acceptance of, wait a minute, I can be in a different shape. I don't have to be the way that he asks me to be. I can actually see and find what my body needs in order to do this. And once I did, I adapted and I changed the way that I sat and found a comfortable way to be. Other people laid down. Others sat into a chair. Others stood up. And it was the most freeing and empowering thing to know that instead of focusing on pain, I could focus on what I was sensing inside my body, what emotions were happening, where I was feeling things otherwise. And it was almost like an invitation to care and heartfulness, and also vulnerability. At the heart of mindfulness practice is being able to be with what is. And another distant relative to mindfulness is the sense of equanimity. And that equanimity is being okay with exactly what is happening in the moment. Ouch. It's not always easy, right? Not always easy at all. So I'll share my screen again. So we did the pause and the seated and standing practice. Oop, is seated and standing practice again. We won't. Movement. And so I'll just ask that you turn the body in such a way that you can lift your arms. Now, again, I recognize we all have different abilities. If you have some shoulder stuff happening, it's not working for you, then you can simply raise your shoulders instead. Or you can lift your arms any amount. So I'm just going to turn slightly to the side and we'll just simply follow our breath here. So as I inhale, I'll raise my arms any amount, and I'm just going to stop shy of going all the way up because that feels better for me today. And then as I exhale, I'm going to lower my arms, and if you can, see if you can kind of match the tempo of your arms and your breath. So really follow it. And so eventually our tempo is going to be different because our breathing is different. You can breathe in, let the arms rise. And you can exhale and take your time to lower. And you'll keep going here. With repetition, the brain becomes less interested in the movement. And then the brain becomes more curious about what's actually happening. So see if that's true for you. Don't believe me, road test that. What I'm noticing is that my left shoulder, which is sometimes cranky, is getting a little cranky. And so that's interesting for me. It's like, oh, okay, so I might just do a little less, but I'll maintain the same slowness and the breath with the movement. I might also notice that my breath is starting to slow down the more I practice this. So my expiration of breath is actually growing. I might also notice that I could just move my arms in up and down and I'm not thinking about how to do it anymore, but I'm thinking more about what's happening inside, that internal landscape. Or maybe I'm thinking a lot less and just experiencing. So whatever you've chosen to do, arms or shoulders, let it come all down to rest here with your next exhale. Eyes can be open or closed, just soft. And notice what you notice. What feels more accessible. What feels more awake. What feels softer. What feels stronger. You can open those eyes. You can type in the chat maybe how that felt for you, or even if it was slightly different from the last practice that we just did, you could note that. This next one is one of my favorites. So we're going to do another practice. So when you're ready, go ahead and just take a look around your room. So you can notice what's in front of you. Notice what's to the right and left. Maybe notice what's behind you and go ahead and actually turn and look. Yawning is good. You might notice what's above. And you might look down toward the floor, and you can take your time with this. And then come back and let your gaze just be slightly off center from the camera or the computer. And then imagine as if you were adjusting the aperture of your eyes, can you get a wide view of what's in front of you? So as if you were kind of in landscape mode, taking it all in. Imagine the outer edges of your eyes widening. There's a softening of the jaw, a softening of the front of the chest. Just take a few more breaths here. And then allow your eyes to maybe catch something that maybe you see all the time. So just to the right of my computer, I have this drawing that a child did for me. I did a talk with some kids and they all sent me these little thank you notes, and it's this giant orange flower. And just take a moment to notice whatever that is that you see all the time right in front of you. And is there a detail, a shape, a line, a color, a shading, something that maybe you didn't pick up before? And just by spending time noticing, how do you value this? Or is there a shift in appreciation for what you're looking at? Maybe it's a photograph. Maybe you're looking at nature. And then notice how your body feels now. And when you're ready, you can bring your attention back toward the screen. There's a wonderful book. It's called On Looking, 11 Walks with Expert Eyes by Alexandra Horowitz. And she writes about noticing how we often have incredibly amateur eyes. We see, but we do not see. We use our eyes, but our gaze is glancing frivolously, considering its object. We see the signs, but not their meanings. We are not blinded, but we have blinders. My deficiency is one of attention. I simply was not paying close enough attention. Though paying attention seems simple, there are many forms of payment. I reckon that every child has been admonished by a teacher or a parent to pay attention. But who tells you how to do it? So the gift of attention, if you've ever heard that love and attention are synonymous. And we'll talk in the later sessions about connection, how to cultivate connection and meaning. And attention is one of those. I love this quote by John Burroughs. He writes, "To find new things, take the path you took yesterday." So I'll challenge you today, if there's a walk that you go on, or even if it's just from the path from wherever you're sitting now to maybe where you go to get a cup of water or to fix or prepare a snack, something like that. In that walk, in that pathway, is there something that you can pause and really notice? Let your eyes' attention really focus and be captured. Another tip on looking, if you notice that I asked you to think about looking at it from a wide view, and we also took a good look around our room. One of the quickest ways to reset your nervous system when you're in a new environment or a new experience is to just gently look around the room. And you might actually realize that you probably already do this. If you ever go into a store or you're in a new situation or you walk into a restaurant, most of us scan the space around us. We want to actually make sure we have the embodiment of safety. And so by looking around, and then our body begins to relax. Yes, I feel safe here. There's just a bunch of people in here. This is how this is. Or non-COVID times, maybe that's how it was. But that's what our body does, right? It takes this quick scan to feel safe. You can actually do that in the presence of a friend, or maybe even someone that you have a little bit of a conflict with, or there isn't some ease, maybe there's dis-ease. If you can really take in your environment, it actually is an autonomic signal right into our nervous system that you're safe in that environment. Then you can adjust your body language, your sitting, your breath, continue to imagine having that wide landscape view. Because what happens when we're scared or fearful is that our eyes actually narrow and become what's called tunnel vision. So we only really see whatever that object is that sparks fear for us. But when we can continue to have that sense of objectivity, a wider gaze, that sense of looking and noticing becomes easier and more calming for our nervous systems. And we'll talk in future sessions a little bit more about the nervous system and how those two ways of looking really influence it. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. We have another practice that we'll do just by looking at our screens. So we're going to take a few moments to gaze at the screen and allow yourself to really take this all in. Maybe some questions are forming in your mind. You can kind of just let those float up. Notice where your eyes go first. Notice where your eyes want to stay. And then notice any shifts or changes in the body. Notice if your breathing is slowed. And then the next moment, if it's comfortable for you, you can either close the eyes or take the eyes down. See if you can still see the image. What colors are still strong for you? What outline still pops out? What details can you remember? And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. There's something called bibliophilia hypothesis, which basically means that humans are intrinsically wired to seek out connections with nature. And that generally means exposing themselves to green spaces, that we're drawn to it. And when in fact we do this, there was a study in 2018 that showed that exposure to green spaces correlated with structural changes in our brain and a greater working memory. In other words, that executive function or prefrontal cortex of our brain. It's pretty powerful. So there is something called the G.I. Joe fallacy. How many of you I'm a child of the 80s. I might be dating myself here. I've only just turned 50, so I probably am dating myself, or pigeonholing. But there was a cartoon, a G.I. Joe, and at the end of the cartoon, he would actually do these PSA announcements like, don't talk to strangers, or how to get out of a fire, those sort of things. And then he would say, well, and knowing is half the battle. And there's a researcher, Laurie Santos, that actually says, no, actually knowing isn't half the battle. Behavioral science shows us that the idea of knowing is a fallacy, and it takes more than that of what you should be doing. You need a strategy. And the other aspect to that is practice. So there's a couple of suggestions that I've put here for you on the screen. Accountability, like, phone a friend. One thing I started to do in the new year is instead of chatting with my friends on the phone locally here, I make a date in the park. And in fact, I make a date in the park that's closest to my house. where it's really convenient for me, where I cannot make any excuses. It takes me 2 minutes to walk there. And I have a little route, it takes about a half hour, and I've got to visit with my friends and move my body. So how can you be more accountable? How can you reach out to others and not assume that they'll reach out to you? Make it easier. So one of the other things that I've also started doing, well, this is like true confessions. I'm not sure how I feel about this being recorded, but I actually, we have a little recumbent bike that we got off of Craigslist, and I've been studying for an exam, for the National Counselor's Exam. Every morning in my pajamas, I don't even change my clothes, and I go to my bike and I study for 20 minutes for my exam, and then I'm done. I don't do any more. I don't worry about how much I've learned or how much I haven't learned. I don't even get out of my pajamas. So how can you make it easier for you? Maybe you set your walking shoes right by your bed. Maybe you've already set your alarm the night before. I always think about my future self. Like, what can I do to give gifts to my future self? Oh, what gift would she like in the morning? Well, I know she would really like the coffee to already be prepared for her. So I set the coffee pot the night before, because like when I get up in the morning, I don't have to clean it out. And it's like this present for myself. It's awesome. So what can you do to make things easier? And then repetition, 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 repetition. I don't know how many of you have a favorite sport or a favorite craft or a hobby that you do. Does anyone have anything that they want to share that they really enjoy, or activity? No. I know someone mentioned earlier they play the guitar. So I think he may have left us, but Robert said he played the guitar.
I like to knit and crochet.
You like to hand crochet?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So do you remember the first time you crocheted something?
Uy, no. I was like 9, 8 years old.
Yeah, it probably was pretty rudimentary. Like, would you have given it away as a gift to someone?
Yes.
Yeah? Your first...
Every blanket I do, it's to give away.
Of course. Now, after that much practice since you were 8, right?
Yes.
When we first start doing something, we're not an expert in it, right? You wouldn't read about crochet and think you knew how to do it, right? You wouldn't go and read about how to start like run a marathon or play, what's the new sport everyone's playing? Pickleball? Does anybody play pickleball? I've read about it. I haven't played it yet. I'm pretty sure that it's not benefiting me just by having read about it. So we have to actually put a plan in place, right? We have to do something in order to do it. And I noticed somebody put jigsaw puzzles in here, and I started doing those at the beginning of the pandemic. And I am terrible at jigsaw puzzles, but I guarantee you I'm a little better at them now. So I can start to pick out shapes. I can start to do things, pick little strategies. So little by little, it's a little bit easier for me. But my big visionary mind isn't necessarily quite that detailed, but it's fun trying. So I hope that those little points are helpful to you today. That G.I. Joe fallacy was a big one for me, that knowledge just simply isn't enough. We have to actually do it and practice it. There is one more thing I wanted to share and leave with you today. And I'm going to go ahead and go back to sharing my screen. I think it shifted in my PowerPoint. As you practice building a home in yourself, you become more beautiful. And that's from the late Thich Nhat Hanh, who just passed away recently. He was a Buddhist monk and meditation teacher who was exiled from Vietnam and began some monasteries, Plum Village in Canada and France, and really influenced so many people through the words and really his gentle and quiet spirit. And I love this. As you practice building a home in yourself, you become more beautiful. And it brings us back to what we first began with, about this idea of well-being isn't perfection or being out of pain or not having suffering, because that's just the human experience. And the same with beauty, right? Someone who smiles, aren't they the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? When the smile is around their eyes, you can tell they feel it. It's extraordinary. Or the laugh of a baby. Oh my gosh. If anyone needs to get a little spruce of serotonin and cheer themselves up, you can Google baby laughter, and it's just the most delightful thing. Beauty, while subjective, really is universal because it's something that we feel intrinsically. So I'll wrap this up and open it up for any dialogue or questions. And as I do that, I'm actually going to stop the recording, and I'll plan to stay a few minutes after as well each time. Normally I'll leave a little bit more cushion toward the end of our sessions for that, but I'll pause the recording. That way, those of you who are a little hesitant to share